Hi everyone, my name is Megha Parthasarathy. I'm a graduate student at Eastern Illinois and I'm part of the MSDI program. And today I'm here to share with you my systematic review on vegetarian diets and mental disorders in adults. Hope you enjoy it. Here's an overview of what I'll be discussing throughout my presentation. In my background, I'll be talking about some important key terms that you'll see throughout the presentation, some really important statistics involving the subjects that I chose, along with why there are people that are even there to consume a vegetarian diet, some root causes, and that. I will then discuss the purpose of my presentation, basically my overall objective and focus point, followed by my methodology. There I'll be talking about my search process, basically what databases I looked at, along with exclusion and inclusion criteria, Prisma, and a chart that lays out all of my 10 articles for you in detail. I will then describe the synthesis of my results and state my conclusion based on those results. Finally, I will talk about the implication on these results and conclusion and relate it to the dietetic profession. Before I continue with the presentation, I thought it would be beneficial to explain some key terms that are important for you to know. So there are many types of vegetarian diets. All include not eating products that contain gelatin. And gelatin is basically a collagen taken from an animal body part and crushed and placed in food products such as gummy bears, Jell-O, marshmallows, and other products that are like gel-like substances. And if we want to really break down the vegetarian diet, first we have the lacto-ovo. When you look at the words lacto, it means milk, and ovo means egg. So when you see lacto-ovo, it means it has milk and eggs in the diet. So overall, it would just exclude meat, fish, poultry, and include plant-based with milk and eggs. There's vegan, which is plant-based foods. There's no animal products at all, no eggs, milk, honey, meat, poultry, fish, any of that. There is pesco vegetarian. That is basically, you have plant-based diets, you have milk, eggs, and you have seafood in your diet, and they just exclude just milk and poultry. If we want to look at the nutrients for the diets, so for lacto-ovo, we have, it lacks protein, iron, calcium, zinc, B12, riboflavin, omega-3s, and vitamin D. And we want to compare it with the other two diets. It's pretty much the same for vegan. The only difference is that it's lacking in more severity, so they would need to replace those low nutrient levels with the foods that are remaining. With pesco, though it's also the same as well, but they're not as severe as lacto would be, considering there's fish included in it, so they would have a little bit more of these nutrients as well. But they still need to find other ways to replace those missing nutrients, and overall it would be less than those who are omnivores. So around the world there is an increased prevalence and awareness in mental disorders, and for my research, most of the studies that I had were focusing basically on two very common mental disorders, which is anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression are general terms of mental disorders, so there are many classifications of both as well. To define these terms, first with anxiety, it is the anticipation of future threats, an excess of fear, and related behavioral disturbances. And depression is defined as common and serious medical illnesses that negatively affect how you feel, the way you think, and how you act. Here are some of the evaluation tools used in the research studies. The first one I have up here is the epidemiology study depression scale. It is basically a 4-factor, 20-question self-reporting measure of the depression symptoms. Basically, they would ask the participants to rate the frequency of depressive symptoms during the previous week. And in that questionnaire, they would have certain statements, and they would have to rate it from 0 to 3. An example would be a statement of, "I feel depressed," and the participants would have to rate from 0, meaning hardly ever, 3, meaning most of the time. And at the end of the 20 questions, they would add up their scores, and depression would be defined if they had a score above 19. So if you count all these questions, the highest you can ever get in this scale would be 60, and the lowest would be about 0. And another scale that was used in a lot of these studies was the depression anxiety scale. That is a 42-item self-reported instrument designed to measure the related negative emotional state of depression, anxiety, and tension/stress. This questionnaire, this instrument would basically be administered online for participants to use. And since it was 3 different scales used in this instrument, the scales would all be intercorrelated with the 3: anxiety, depression, and tension stress as well. So a little bit of statistics on some prevalences between vegetarian diets and mental disorders. So there are 1.5 billion vegetarians worldwide, which I found was very shocking because as a vegetarian myself, I thought there wasn't that many around me that didn't really eat meat. Though the percentage of aged 8 to 18 who are vegetarians hasn't really changed much in the past few decades, which is why I thought focusing my research on adults would be more beneficial compared to focusing on adolescents and children. As for the mental health prevalences, there was a study in 2017 that estimated 792 million people lived with a mental disorder, which is so shocking. And you never know, there's probably at least half of them that probably don't even know it. And overall, slightly, it is more than 1 in 10 people globally. And out of the whole world's population, if you want to look at gender-wise, there's about 9.3% of them are male and 11.9% female. So they're pretty equal when it comes to the prevalences between genders. It's not substantially one gender at all, so it's relatable to both. So why are there people that actually eat a vegetarian diet? Well, there's so many different reasons. Some of these reasons would be that it's associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease and metabolic syndrome. So basically, it would reduce your chance of obesity, lower your blood pressure, and lower your risk of getting type 2 diabetes. Another reason would be prevent risk of some cancers. So it would promote to reduce the majority cause of disabilities and mortality all over the world. It is also becoming a popular choice among adults nowadays. It's for those who care about animal welfare or animal rights, poverty, health reasons, such as the reasons I mentioned earlier, and also for those who are environmentally conscious. Religion is also another reason why there are those who eat a vegetarian diet. The 3 very common religions that follow vegetarian diets are Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism. While Jainism, it's very strict about eating vegetarian diets, there are those that are Hindus and Buddhists that don't eat vegetarian diets. It's an option, but overall, these three are the main that primarily follow a vegetarian diet in general. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a vegetarian myself. Uh, I initially began eating vegetarian diet because of my religion. I'm a Hindu. Later, I started following the vegetarian diet because of a lot of health issues. I saw that it was beneficial that way, and also for the environment as well. So here is the purpose of my presentation here. So the purpose of my presentation and research is to assess the influences between vegetarian diets and mental disorders in adults. When I first began looking for my primary articles, I initially searched through three, which was EBSCO, Science Direct, and JSTOR, and in them I used keywords like vegetarian diets, mental disorders association, and out of the articles I was able to find, I found that they were some of them were not peer-reviewed. After using some of the tools that Dr. Moulding gave us to look through them, and in order to replace them, I couldn't find the articles that I needed in those three. So I began venturing out and searching through PubMed, and some of the articles that I found that were peer-reviewed and had my exclusion and inclusion criteria, I looked in their reference lists and I started searching articles through there and seeing if they fitted my criteria or not. And from these basically 5 main sources, I was able to pull together about 10 primary sources. So when looking through the databases and finding my articles, I had some inclusion exclusion criteria that had to be met in order for it to be included in my research. And the first one was that it had to be within 10 years, so I think the earliest I would have accepted would have been 2009 to 2020. The participants already had to be following a vegetarian diet. By that I meant that they had to exclude meat from their diet, so anything with like lacto-ovo, pesco-vegetarian, ovo-vegetarian, or even just plain lacto, that would have been fine. I just had to have no meat in their diet, at least meat and poultry. They had to be adult participants, so over the age of 18. Anything with teens or children, anything like that, that was in the study were excluded out. I filtered all that out. The participants had to make sure that the participants weren't already pregnant or lactating, because for those who are pregnant and lactating, they have different nutrient requirements, and I thought that would affect the results on the studies, or have any pre-existing mental disorders, so to avoid any biases or confounding variables as well. And my last one was that it had to be a peer-reviewed article to make sure that the journals and the articles were credible enough to use, to make it as credibly sound as possible. So what you have here is my PRISMA, and that stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. Basically, this whole the PRISMA would just show others how I found my articles in my search process. So I first identified records through Science Direct, EBSCO, JSTOR, and later PubMed. And there, total combined, I found 1,361 articles. And with some additional records, as I mentioned earlier, I looked through reference lists from some of the articles that I found from these 4 databases, and through the reference list I found that they were relatable for my research, and there that I found about 35 that I screened through. And after removing duplicates, Total combined articles that I had were 1,370 articles, and out of those, I screened about 50 of them, and I excluded about 70 out of it. The full text articles that I assessed for eligibility, so I looked through my inclusion and exclusion criteria, were about 35. And one great thing about Booth's Library is I was able, even though there were articles that I couldn't find the full text, I was able to request it and borrow it from the Booth Library for a certain amount of time. So out of that, it was about 35 that I found I was able to get the full text. And out of the 35, there were the full text that I excluded with some reason were about 15. And the reasons why I excluded them were that they were participants who were less than 18, so they were adolescent, teens, or children. They were articles that had animal subjects. I didn't want that in my research, so I excluded them. There I found about 2. And one of my next biggest was the not peer-reviewed, which I mentioned earlier. I found there were many journals that were not peer-reviewed articles, so I excluded them as well. And after my search process, the studies that included the quantitative synthesis were basically 10, and I found my total articles of primary sources were 10 articles. So here I have a chart that would organize my articles. I thought it would be better to organize it this way, so that way I would be able to understand what exactly is going on in each study and what they found, along with some of the details as well. And so I organized it by author, year, study design, participants, evaluation, location, and results/conclusion. So as you can see, I chose my articles within the last 10 years. So the earliest was about 2010, and they were mostly observational studies. And the evaluation methods that I talked about earlier, they used mostly the depression anxiety scale, the epidemiology study scale, to determine the state of depression or anxiety or attention in the participants. As for the food frequency questionnaire, that was used mostly to figure out which participants were vegetarian versus which one were not. And they were all self-reported data and survey questions, so participants were able to log in their information for the researchers to use as well. And as for the results, for the most part, I have listed how the association and as well as the location, because most of the articles I found out were from various countries as well. I wanted to point out one of the articles, Meester 2016 one. That one was basically focusing on a specific type of depression compared to others. Others were all the broad term of depression and anxiety. This one was a seasonal affective disorder, which is basically means that patients will exhibit depressive symptoms on certain seasons as well, which I thought was really important to point out. So last week, I sent you an email about an article that I wanted you to read. The article that I chose this article because it best focused on what I wanted to study involving this systematic review. In the article, the vegetarian diets were more distinctive. They really segregated it by like pesco, lacto-ovo, omnivorous, and vegan especially. Unlike most of my other articles, they just claimed that vegetarian diets were excluding meat and poultry, some of them just didn't make that distinction. And to talk about my article here, there was about 999,884 subjects that were above 18 were pooled from France through random sampling. And out of that, about 90,380 completed the study. And they were asked diet information through the following 9 items, basically through a food frequency questionnaire. So the 24 items that were given for them to choose was meat, poultry, fish, eggs, milk, dairy, fruit, legumes, and grains. And out of those who completed the survey, they were evaluated using the tool of the Center of the Epidemiology Study Depression Scale, which I mentioned earlier, with the 20 questions and them rating it. And the depressive symptoms were defined by a score of greater or equal to 19 on the scale, and the participants that filled out the diet survey information were separated into groups, like I mentioned. They were separated into omnivorous, basically those who eat meat, pesco-vegetarian, those who eat fish, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, that includes milk and eggs, and vegan, that excludes all animal products. So in addition to taking into account the diet information and separating them into groups, I really liked how they asked other variables. They took those variables into account when finding the results. And these variables that they took into account would have been socioeconomic status, any other pre-existing illnesses, such as like any CVD, type 2 diabetes, and their education level, because they thought that it's very important to take into those accounts because that can make a difference in the results that you taken. And after that, the results that they found were that there was an association of depressive symptoms with vegetarian diets. But however, they also suggest that the association could just be specifically not just vegetarian diets. It could be any other diet that's missing a certain nutrient. So it's regardless of the exclusion or the food type, it would be associative with depressive symptoms. So I broke down my articles into study design, location, and evaluation. So as you can see, the study design, there's mostly observational studies, 1 cohort study, and 3 cross-sectional studies. And the observational studies are obviously with no intervention. They're not manipulated or experimented on. The 1 cohort study followed a longevity study of about 8 years later. But as for most of my studies were at the present and at certain times, and unfortunately I couldn't find a randomized control trial. But at least the cohort study would have shown a longevity of the study and showed a result for 8 years later as well. The locations were all over the world. I thought it was really important to get information from other parts of the world, even though the focus is on US. And locations that I had were USA, obviously, Germany, Austria, Russia, Spain, Holland, Finland, and China. And the evaluation methods that were for the majority of the studies were the Depression and Anxiety Scale and Epidemiological Studies Depression Scale. About 4 of the studies used the Epidemiology Studies Depression Scale, and the Food Frequency Questionnaire was used for a majority of them as well. They thought it was the best way to get data from the participants about their diet, so they were all self-reported as well, and it's easily accessible to the participants. So after my methods, I narrowed it down to 10 studies, primary resources down. And after looking through the studies, some things I found in common were that they all used self-reported diets. The diets were not monitored or anything. It was mostly used through food frequency questionnaires. They were all used a standardized scale to measure out depression and anxiety out of the two evaluation tools that I mentioned earlier. And out of the studies that did focus on both female and male, there were really no differences in the results between the genders versus those who just focused on just one gender as well. And overall, there was about 6 to 7 studies suggested that there is a correlation between consuming vegetarian diets and mental disorders. So why did I choose so many studies around the world? Well, knowledge can come from anywhere, and as researchers, we can always benefit a significant amount of knowledge by utilizing resources from all over the world. And like I mentioned before, there's 1.5 billion vegetarians worldwide, meaning there are hundreds of studies that can have access to thanks to modern technology. And the map that I have above would have been it shows the prevalence of vegetarians. So the purple is the vegetarian population. And just like those who eat vegetarian diets, there are also those with mental disorders. And mental disorders is a national occurrence. There are 792 million people in the world living with mental disorders. So using studies from all other parts of the world really can help USA compare its occurrence with other countries, and as well as getting knowledge from them as well and broadening that research spectrum. So starting with some strengths with my articles, I found that there was a standard scale for testing, especially for the depression and anxiety. They used those very specific evaluation tools that could be easily explained and measured in. They also, a lot of them accounted for the participants' other conditions, like their socioeconomic status, CVD, type 2 diabetes, any metabolic issues that they had, including the article that I was talking about earlier. Many of them also had large sample sizes. One great benefit with having a large sample size is that it reduces the risks of having any type of biases compared to a small group, and it's more accurate results you would get with a larger group. So you could see like what the majority responses are. And finally, the use of Prisma was a strength. It really showed, it was able to break down all of my articles and organize them into inclusion and exclusions, and also took into account my additional resources as well. As for weaknesses, so with the diet and portion, they were all self-reported data. None of the articles were able to monitor whether they were actually eating a vegetarian diet. They just measured and studied based on what the participants wrote in the food frequency questionnaire or any surveys. Before the participants even wrote down what they were eating as well, the researchers, well, some of them were not specific in the vegetarian diets, like did not separate it. There was few that did, like I mentioned with the article that I sent you, but most of them just mentioned that if you don't eat meat, poultry, you're vegetarian, that's it. They didn't take into account of those who might have been eating vegan, pesco, vegetarian, or lacto-ovo also as well. And because it's above 18, it's a large age gap, so the articles didn't, there were various age groups within the adult range. Some of them were college students, there were some that were 40, like middle age, so it was not all in the same age group, which might have affected some of the results. And because I mentioned earlier that it was mostly observational studies are not manipulated or experimented on. Is basically whatever is there, that's what they will measure. So, which means that there is no intervention that was placed in most of these articles as well. So based on my results, it's important to remember that correlation does not equal causation. So the results basically suggest that while there is a correlation between vegetarian diets and mental disorders, there is no evidence that shows that it is the root cause of one's risks of developing mental disorders. I thought it was really important to remember that there are definitely other variables that could have been the cause of mental disorders as well, and that vegetarian diets are not solely the cause of it. So to basically summarize my research presentation, the purpose of this presentation and research is to assess the influences between vegetarian diets and mental disorders in adults. And to find my articles, I searched through 4 different databases and additional resources, which is the reference list, as mentioned in my Prisma. I found 10 primary resources through filtering out all the studies in these various databases. And after finding 10 primary resources, my results were that it suggested that there was a correlation between consuming vegetarian diets, but there is no evidence that shows that vegetarian diets are the sole etiology of one's risks of developing mental disorders. So for further research, I'd like to point out that mental disorders is a very broad term, and even though I chose a lot of studies that did focus on anxiety and depression, it is still a very broad classification because there are so many disorders that are depression and anxiety related as well, even though there were standardized scales to measure out the symptoms. As for the vegetarian diets, I thought it'd be really beneficial if the requirements was more specified because vegetarian diet is very broad with different inclusion and exclusion foods. It'd be really beneficial if they really separated between, lacto-ovo or lacto and ovo, pesco vegetarians, and vegan versus the omnivorous as well. I think the results would have been a lot better and more conclusive if they were just more specified between the two variables. So after seeing the results of that there is a correlation between vegetarian diets and mental disorder risks, as dietitians we should also keep in mind that there is still a health benefit to vegetarian diets. As when we have clients, we always have to inform them of foods rich in nutrients because we want them to replace the nutrients that are lost by not eating meat, poultry, or in some cases even any animal products. And if we cannot find any, if there's not an ability for them to eat and to make up the foods that are rich in these nutrients, we can always encourage supplements as well. I'd like to thank you so much for listening to my presentation on vegetarian diets and mental disorders. I really hope you learned something from my presentation, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you. I'd like to point out that these are my reference slides.